welcome to the Good Roads podcast. I am your host, Thomas Barakat. Joining me in the co-host chair today, Andrew Blackburn, Good Roads' government relations advisor. How's it going, Andrew?
Can't complain, or I can complain, but I won't in this medium.
Right on. Well, we've got a really exciting episode today. We have a really interesting guest. A lot of you might know him from his work in Vox or Bloomberg City Lab. We're being joined by David Zipper, who is a senior fellow at the MIT Mobility Initiative, and he'll be a keynote speaker at the 2025 Good Roads Conference in the spring. David, thanks for joining us on the show. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, we have so many things that we want to talk to you about. I'm not actually sure how I want to open this, and I've kind of been considering if this is the starting one I want to go with. But you know what? Since it's so fresh in all of our minds, you guys just had an election in the U.S. I think we heard something about that here in Canada. We're not here to talk politics. That's not what we do here on the Good Roads podcast. But we know that there's going to be some transportation implications when there's a change in administration. So kind of want to pick your brain a little bit about that, kind of get started with that, and we'll kind of move on. But, you know, we had a Trump presidency and a Trump administration from 2016 to 2020. Do you want to kind of walk us through a little bit what happened then and what you can maybe possibly foresee happening over the next few years? And then we'll see like kind of how this would affect us here in Canada. But yeah, what are your thoughts?
Well, I have many thoughts, and we're recording this just for those who might be listening in, like less than 2 days after the election. So we're right now. All we can do is basically sort of make educated guesses and inferences based on Trump and his previous administration, and what he's been saying on the campaign trail, which, to be honest, has had virtually nothing to do with transportation. This was not a very policy-oriented campaign, right? Other than every now and then, Trump would take a moment to bash electric vehicles. So it doesn't feel like the next administration is going to do a lot to sort of promote clean transportation. But I would say, a few insights I might share just based on what Trump did in transportation during his first term. And I live in Washington, D.C., so I was watching this pretty closely. One is that there's going to be likely a shift toward road construction and bridge construction and away from transit, away from walking and biking, which has been a priority under President Biden and Secretary Buttigieg. Under Trump round one, there was really a laissez-faire approach, I guess I'd say, toward autonomous vehicles and innovation, where basically whatever the private sector wants to do is pretty much fine. And particularly given Elon Musk's prominent role in the Trump reelection campaign, I don't expect US DOT to do much of anything to ensure that autonomous vehicles are safe, to do anything to sort of provide oversight. I think it's going to be kind of like the Wild West to a large degree with transportation innovation. So those are some initial thoughts I might share.
Huh. So it's interesting. You mentioned that you feel like he's not going to push the EV thing, but then you also mentioned Elon Musk's prominent role in the campaign. Are you thinking that the Trump-Musk partnership might not pan out the way Mr. Musk thinks that it would?
Well, let's put it this way. There aren't a lot of people who were working closely with Donald Trump in his first administration who still speak highly of him. Trump has a way of driving everybody away over time, it seems. Like a lot of his closest advisors endorsed Harris or Trump's chief of staff literally called him a fascist, but perhaps don't need to get into that in a transportation podcast. But I think with regards to Tesla and Musk, Tesla at this point is, it's not clear that it's really an EV company. It's kind of like an EV, innovation manufacturing, like House of Wonder or something, if you take it at its face value, where they can create all kinds of fascinating technologies that no one really knows how they work or if they ever would work, from robo-taxis to robots to God knows what. So I'm not sure that Musk would be that upset to basically hear Tesla described in ways that go far beyond or even anathema to describing it as an electric vehicle company.
Hmm.
Yeah, well, and you said that Trump doesn't really keep his friends over time, so I expect we'll see a lot of new faces in his in major positions. I know we were hearing about RFK possibly taking over the health department. I'd be interested to see who ends up being Trump's Secretary of Transportation. Who knows? Like, I mean, it could be a goon from his arsenal, or it could be, I don't know if Musk would be interested in taking over that
Musk's not going to
position.
want to do that. No, Musk is, I think, going to want to stay outside and
Yeah,
just try to like mount a war on regulations, which
yeah.
is troubling. But I frankly think this has been a unique period the last several years in the U.S. where, because of Pete Buttigieg, the Department of Transportation has been very high profile in the U.S., and that's unusual. I
Yeah.
expect it to have a much lower profile in the next few
Yeah.
years.
Well, that's something that we've had Good Roads a little bit of jealousy over, because there is actual federal support for Vision Zero, and Pete Buttigieg has been very big on boosting that, and there's federal funding for that. Here we don't have that top-down support. It's really just down to the municipal level, which means that implementation is much more on a smaller scale. So yeah, we look to the south as like, well, at least they got that top-down support that we're sort of lacking, sort of. Yeah, the ground support is really the only way you see it here.
Yeah, I don't know. I might maybe the grass is a little greener, I would argue, because
Yeah,
like Buttigieg, I think, does care about Vision Zero and road safety. He's a former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and he declared the federal government committing to zero deaths. But a lot of that is sort of good, gets good press, and it's good talking points. But the U.S. Department of Transportation has been hamstrung in what it can do by Congress, and a lot, and I'm not sure we've seen huge change in road safety or in transportation spending over the last 4 years, in the way, although even though Buttigieg talks about it differently. And by the way, Andrew, I'd point out, do you know when I say the grass is always greener? Do you know what the difference is between the likelihood that an American is going to die in a crash versus a Canadian?
yeah, very familiar with the stats difference. That's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, literally, the American is 2.5 times more likely to die.
Yeah.
It's a huge gap. So I don't think you should be
No,
aspiring our transportation.
definitely get the point. That's actually another curse, because usually it's like when we're trying to highlight the
I was just going to say this. Yeah.
systemic failures in Ontario, is like, this is bad, this is bad. It's usually just all like, yeah, but we're like so much better than the states. We're like,
We're so
Yeah.
low.
it really makes our stats seem like we're doing a really good job,
Well,
when they can always be better, obviously.
well, as President George W. Bush once said, you're suffering from the soft bigotry of low expectations. Literally, is what he talked about with education.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll throw that out there
It's
for
always
you.
one of those comparisons. It's like we're so close to the states, so we're just directly compared. And then I think it's both. It's usually the same in Canada and the United States, that proclamation that we're not Europe. You know what I mean? It's like, as if that was something that's impossible to aspire to. You know?
Yeah, well, I have many thoughts about that, but yeah, I mean, I'll be, in all seriousness, as an American, there's a lot about Canadian transportation and urban planning that I admire and think the U.S. could and should learn from. And some of it's at the local and provincial level, like looking at one of the reasons why Canada is so much safer with regards to crashes compared to the U.S. is that the cities are a lot denser, the major cities. It's a more urbanized country, but also the cities are bigger and denser, which makes more people, relatively speaking, ride transit. And this is one of the things that we don't really think about as a road safety contributor. But if you have more people, like if you really want to be safe, don't get inside an SUV, get in a bus, get on a train. And a lot more Canadians do that than Americans. And that's one of the big reasons, I think, why, in fact, that's what the data suggests, that Canadians are safer. We don't think about that in the US, but I wish we did.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's another thing that's just like, we always we like to trash our own public transportation systems. We're not as bad as the states, but
We're always
it's another thing that we're always looking with envy at Europe, and especially Asia. It's like, yeah.
No. I mean, everybody. I mean, I think that's important. You have to have something to aspire to. I guess you could just argue, look, the U.S. is further behind in a lot of these ways, so we look to Canada, and I think for the next few years, we're going to continue doing that because it's going to be a rocky period south of the right.
So before we move on, I want to kind of make the segue here between the U.S. And Canada and road safety in a sense. You mentioned what you thought was going to happen with the Trump administration. We know that there's a regulatory proposal. The NHTSA has had something out for, I think that's for vehicle standards, how they're built. I guess would that change with a new federal government? Because I know that in Canada, a lot of times we don't make our vehicles safer, or we don't want to deviate from what the U.S. does too much, because from a manufacturing perspective, it makes it a lot more difficult to do to manufacture them. Do you see anything changing? Do you think the Trump administration will just kind of revoke that proposal? I don't know. What do you see happening there?
Yeah, so what you're referring to is a proposal that came out in, I believe it was September, from USDOT. And it was really the first time that NHTSA, which is the automotive safety entity or agency within the Department of Transportation in the US, it's the first time that NHTSA proposed forcing automakers to redesign their vehicles or take into account in their vehicle designs the safety of pedestrians. It would be what's called a Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard related to head-hood interactions, meaning that basically that automakers would have to show that the design of their hood would not cause an excessive risk of death or serious injury if it's struck by the head of an adult or a small child. And there's ways of doing these sorts of tests that have long been done in Europe and Australia and other rich countries, but the U.S. has never done it. And meanwhile, the U.S. in 2022 set a 40-year high in pedestrian deaths, the most since Jimmy Carter was president. So this is really long, and part of the problem is car design. I know this is the case in Canada, although not quite to the extent I believe that is in the U.S., but sedans and station wagons have been replaced by SUVs and pickups, and those SUVs and pickups keep getting bigger year by year, a phenomenon called car bloat. That's what I call it. At least I've read a bunch of stories about this.
Yeah.
And that NHTSA proposal that you just referenced, Thomas, would have been the first real move to counteract car bloat. So your question was, what now with Trump coming in? And I find it very difficult to see a scenario where this rule comes into effect and is maintained, partly because the incoming USDOT can revoke it, also because Congress can revoke it too if it's in Republican control. But even more disappointingly, this rule really was, I was hoping, a lot of people were hoping it was going to be the beginning of a whole bunch of rules from NHTSA that would protect pedestrians and cyclists. So looking at torso impacts or blind zones. And it's very hard to imagine any of that happening in a Trump administration. It feels like car bloat is going to continue unfettered. I hate to say it, but it's true.
Yeah, bigger and stronger cars, like, part of it's part of making America great again. We want bigger, huger cars for the good of the nation, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're more profitable, so I guess that's good for the automakers in Detroit and the unions, but it's not good for pedestrians or even those are smaller cars too.
I guess the only thing we can hope for is that this flies under the radar because they're much more preoccupied with disruption and changing things on a fundamental level. So I guess probably not, but
I don't know. One can hope for incompetence, but I don't know this time around. We'll see. In case you're wondering about my political leanings there, you're getting a glimpse.
Okay, well, let's shift. I know our listeners are mostly based here in Ontario. We do have listeners from all over, but mostly from Ontario. Let's talk a little bit about Ontario. I think you've probably heard, some things. We've been making some waves, I think, on the transportation file. Certainly over the past few weeks, but I would say even maybe over the past few months and years on various different things. But I want to talk specifically about this proposal to essentially ban bike lanes or to restrict the ability of local governments to institute bike lanes on main arterial roads, without getting special approval from our Ministry of Transportation, which is akin to like a state DOT
Yeah.
south of the border there. What do you? I mean, what have you heard? I guess, and what do you think of such a proposal? Would this be effective? Would this be? And sorry, the argument is that it would reduce congestion. That's the main impetus behind our provincial government's approach to implementing this.
Uh, yeah, I have seen a little bit about this. It managed to even penetrate south of the border in some of the news cycles during a very heated election. So, congrats to Ontario for achieving that. Yeah, I guess my initial reaction when I see this is to first say, okay, show me the evidence that a bike lane is causing congestion. Show me the evidence. This is something that is like a trope that people in cars say over and over and over again, that bike lanes are slowing me down, and there's just no evidence of it. There's just no evidence of it. You take the bike lanes away, then there's going to be slightly wider lanes, and they're still going to be congested. And even if there's like the Taj Mahal of bike lanes that you get rid of that on a congested road and stick in another lane of cars, that's going to be congested too because of induced demand, which is this phenomenon whereby car traffic expands to fill up however much roadway is available in an urban area. And induced demand, I mean, is it worth talking about induced demand for a second to explain what that is? To folks?
Yeah, please.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, induced demand, we've actually known about this for a century, believe it or not. It's just something that feels counterintuitive, and drivers don't like it, and politicians don't like it, and the road industry doesn't like it. So we're just sort of in denial about it, but it's a law. It's like it's the iron law of congestion, according to Anthony Downs, who codified it in the 1960s. But basically, the idea is that when you have a congested road and you widen it to add another lane or two to relieve congestion, you do actually get faster trips for a little while. But what will happen relatively quickly, like in a matter of weeks, months, maybe a year or two at the most, is that people will realize, oh, look, there's more space. I can drive faster there during peak times. So they'll start to change their travel behavior. Maybe before they traveled really early or in the middle of the day to avoid rush hour times. Now they're going to go at rush hour. Maybe before they took the train, and now they're like, it's okay to drive because the car trip is faster. Maybe they are going to take car trips they wouldn't have taken at all. And so what ends up happening is that you have the traffic come back, congestion rises until it's basically just as bad as it was before. That's induced demand, and it can lead to basically more cars on the road, more pollution, more congestion, and a lot of wasted money. This is what's happened in the most famous example in America is the Katy Freeway outside of Houston, Texas. That's, I think, over 25 lanes in certain places. It's wild.
Wow.
But it was like over $1 billion spent widening it, and it led to actually longer commute times on it. This is west of the city of Houston. So I guess what I would say to my friends in Ontario and Toronto is what's probably happening from what I can see is that you've got a premier and a transportation minister, I guess, is that what you would call it?
Yep.
In Ontario, that recognizes Toronto has very bad traffic congestion. And rather than taking that issue seriously and proposing serious solutions, such as denser development, transit-oriented development, more transit service, he is looking for a scapegoat. And bicyclists and bike lanes are a convenient scapegoat. Mm-hmm. And I think that's unfortunate. I think it's misleading. I think it's not going to lead to anything good from a transportation network if it's fulfilled. And I hope that, I frankly hope that my friends in Ontario will be able to fight it off because it's a terrible idea.
One of the reasons I really like that Katy Freeway example, because there's a lot of these, there's an assessment about the Bloor Street is like one of the main corridors that they put in over the pandemic. And they're pointing to this is one of the arguments that they have, that it's increasing congestion because there's like a 1 to 2 minute statistical increase in congestion, but it's actually because of the pandemic. Like the stats they're using are because like traffic was really, really low in 2020 when they were first put in, and that the traffic has grown. And it's kind of funny when you can point to the Katy Freeway, because I think the increase in traffic when they added those lanes was actually like 20 minutes commute changes. It's like it's hilarious that you can add lanes and it can create that big of a problem. I don't know if this is too early to segue into Toronto's equivalent, which is the 401, which I believe, Thomas, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that the widest it gets, we're approaching 20 lanes at some widths.
Yeah, it's one of the busiest highways in North America, one of the widest, certainly. But yeah, it's they've it's almost like one of those things where we've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas in terms of how to actually deal with that, other than just add more lanes. It's like we're just gonna keep doing the same thing over and over again and wonder why. And the argument that is always given is, well, the region is growing. There's more people now than there was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So like, I guess the logic is like you have more people, so you have more cars, so we need more road. But like at some point, I feel like it has to kind of a switch has to flip and say, well, maybe that's not what we have to do. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to have happened yet because our provincial government, our premier, they're one of their like kind of flagship policies is to build another mega highway north of the city to reduce congestion. And that's going to cost billions and billions of dollars, which I personally think, and I think we as an organization think, would be much better spent on transit. And also just, there's a huge maintenance backlog of infrastructure that we already have that is just kind of getting worse and worse, especially at the local level. There's so many smaller, local governments and towns all over the province that could use money like that to actually like repair their infrastructure. But we're kind of just putting it into something where, like you said, might be good for a few years, and then it will just probably end up being clogged as well. But yeah, it's just a pattern that kind of keeps on happening. And it's just, I don't know, in this space, we're looking for like real solutions, not just kind of rehashing ideas from 50 years ago that have never solved the issue.
Well, it also just begs the question of, in a big, dense urban core like Toronto's, where are all those cars going to go? Like, are you just going to build the world's largest underground parking structures and just keep adding deeper and deeper and deeper levels? Like, there's at some point, it's just untenable. Like, imagine, take an extreme position. Like, imagine if, like Manhattan without the subway. Like, it would just be it would just be literally impossible to navigate. It would just cease functioning. And if Toronto wants to be an even more great global city than it already is, you have to find ways for people to navigate through the city and get to jobs, get to the places they want to go without taking up a disproportionate share of space. And that's the fundamental problem of the urban automobile. It's a very inefficient way of navigating a dense place. It takes a ton of street space to get one or two people at most, two people usually, to where they want to go. That's the beauty of walking. It's the beauty of transit. It's the beauty of biking. It's a far more space efficient means of mobility that can scale. And that's why, yeah, I mean, Thomas, I share your skepticism that a new outer beltway or whatever it is going to relieve congestion. I actually think that, this is a very common tension between outer suburbs and dense cities, because outer suburbs want to develop and whatever else. But ultimately, if you build a whole bunch of car infrastructure in your suburbs or exurbs, you're only going to make these sorts of tensions worse, because you're creating the expectation that people, when they buy a car, because they need it to live way out wherever they are, that they can park it where they want to. And that's simply not feasible in the urban core. So it's not a viable long-term strategy.
Yeah. And it's interesting. It's like, I always kind of compare what we're doing here in Canada, North America more generally, but to other parts of the world. Andrew alluded to like Europe, and a lot of people say we're not Europe, but like last week we heard that Paris is now limiting cars into their city center, and and it's not even just they're banning cars or anything. They're saying you can't drive through the city center with your car if the destination is not within this kind of area. And you're seeing these kinds of things happening, and like I always kind of, whenever I travel to Europe and I come back, I kind of get a little bit down and depressed a little bit. Think like why have other places figured this out, but like we haven't yet in North America. You kind of look at these things. Have you ever come to some sort of conclusion? Is it just a cultural thing that like has to change and it will take a lot of time, or is this something that's just like is there something else there?
It's a complicated question, and it's a difficult one. Particularly catching me at a moment where it's hard to be especially optimistic in my country right after the election. But no, I mean, you're right about Paris, which has banned through traffic. By the way, it's not just Paris that has done that. Brussels, even before Paris, basically prevented through traffic through what's called the Pentagon, the heart of Paris, in that way. And London, you could argue the congestion charge that's imposed for around the zone of London is really a way of deterring vehicles from driving through it as well. Like find other ways of getting around a city. I think it's a really smart move. Could it happen in the U.S.? I mean, have in North America, I should say. We were inches away from imposing congestion charging in Manhattan, right? We were right there doing it, and then Kathy Hochul took the rug out from under us. So I wouldn't say it's impossible, and that really is, by the way, a deterrent from through traffic as well as a deterrent from driving writ large. And I also feel like when I try to find like little pieces of optimism to latch on to, the example I like to cite is actually from just before the pandemic. It's been sort of memory hold now, but in October of 2019, New York City made 14th Street in Manhattan car free. Do you remember this by chance?
Yeah, I think I remember hearing about that.
Yeah, and it was hugely controversial, delayed for a long time in the courts from nearby residents who were sure it was going to create like a car nightmare in the Greenwich Village and whatnot. And when it happened, everybody's like anxious, what's going to happen? And the people loved it. Not only was there not more traffic on nearby streets, New Yorkers were flocking there, like reveling in this like oasis of quiet. Like we just forget how cars and honking and exhaust is just a ubiquitous feature of urban living. And people enjoyed it so much, it was known as the Miracle on 14th Street. That was October of 2019. And 5 months later, the pandemic kicked in and we've sort of are in a different place now. But I don't think it's right to say that America can't have nice things like in Europe or Canada too. I think we should have higher expectations for ourselves and our cities.
Yeah. Usually in our jurisdictions, it's kind of we're always looking for it halfway. We always want to keep the cars, and we're trying to get the best of both worlds. We were trying to do it with the bike lanes. That was another thing on the bluer bike lanes, where everybody was doomsaying about it and saying how businesses would be impacted. But of course, once the cyclists actually got on the road, the BIA's changed their tune because the business was doing better.
Usually, I've seen the studies of that, Andrew. It's such an important point. But
yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, well, no, it's kind of interesting comparing that with the pandemic because when everybody was doing street eats, I just read that this is sort of declining in America. All this excitement about eating outside, and in New York and Boston and Philadelphia, they're all sort of declining. But in Toronto, just to give Toronto some credit for once, we've actually been expanding the program over the last couple of years. Our Cafe TO program, I think they saw the biggest year ever. They're a lot more organized, a lot more proactive this year, but it's kind of a nice little silver lining where it's just like people actually saw the good in it, and they saw a glimpse of a positive future and actually went for it. So it's kind of nice to see that at the end of patio season when it's still it's still like 23 degrees out there, so you can still be ambitious about patio season if you really want to. But
the thing about Canadians I've learned is like patio season or shorts season seems to like continue until like it's not like not just snowing, but like blizzards.
Yeah,
like you guys are made of stuff.
The thing with it is like it could if we can go a little bit further. Sure, we got the patios, we're eating out on the street, but just imagine if there wasn't cars zooming by 2 feet away from you. Just 100%. Imagine how much nicer that would be.
Yeah. No, well, kudos to Toronto then, because you're exactly right that in the U.S., most cities have sort of taken away these sort of outside dining areas, which is just so sad because everybody loved the pandemic and they would still love it now. It's just for some reason we have to give it back to street parking, which is
I mean, everybody goes out to Paris and they want to sit on the cafe, sit out on the street and drink coffee. It's just like you could do that at home if you really wanted to.
They never get that. I know. I never understand that disconnect. You'll pay to fly over to Europe. do all this good stuff, and then come back and then oppose any changes that would like even remotely improve or move in that direction. I've never understood that. And yeah, like again, I talked about going to Europe and whatnot, but car-free streets is another thing. And some people think that car-free streets, like you alluded to it in Manhattan, there was one area where they did it, but car-free streets, like in Europe, especially like, I mean, in the summer, I like to go to Southern Europe a lot. Even some of these small towns, they just have car-free streets like it's nothing. Big cities, small cities, mid-sized cities, they all kind of have it to a degree. And then you come back to North America and you're like, oh, this is so, like, how have we not tried this yet? But there were some, obviously, like you mentioned, New York, but Montreal really comes to mind because I was in Montreal a couple of years ago now, but I was really shocked. Like, I think it did start during the pandemic or came out of the pandemic, but they have really, really taken it seriously and kept on expanding it. And from what I hear, the people like it, the businesses like it. There's always going to be the naysayers about, oh, you know, where are we going to park, or the businesses aren't going to thrive, how will they get deliveries, all this sort of stuff. But then it works. Like, if it can work in other places, it can work here. So I always kind of like, I've been looking at Montreal as kind of like inspiration that, hey, this is a Canadian city. This is a North American city. They have colder weather than we do in Toronto, maybe not by much, but enough. You can't use the whole, winter excuse, or it's too cold, or whatever. It's not year round, obviously. They kind of close it in the winter and then restart it again in the spring. But we can do it if we want to.
Yeah. Well, they're also a good example of bike lanes. They've gone full throttle on bike lanes. Yeah. You probably got more details on it there, but like culturally, they're just more accepting of it. And they bike through the winter. I applaud them for that, because I don't even bike through the winter.
It's a colder, snowier city than Toronto. And it is, I mean, can you imagine the Quebec premier saying we're going to take away bike lanes from Montreal? There would literally be barricades. It's impossible to imagine, like never in a million years. And if I would just say, frankly, I like both cities, but if I was a Torontonian, I'd be a little embarrassed that Montreal is kicking my ass in cycling.
Yeah. Quebec, one thing they also have is a much better protest culture. More
robust.
Yeah,
I say, right?
Exactly. We just lay down and we take it. Literally, we do die-ins. That's what we do.
It's the lip of the British background, right, or something like that. Yeah. No. I actually flew from. It's funny. I flew from Montreal to Toronto this spring for something, and I will say the one thing that Toronto definitely kicks Montreal's ass on is Billy Bishop. The idea of walking from an airport to my hotel was mind blowing. Didn't we talk about? I don't know if we talked about this before, Thomas, but that is one thing.
You mentioned when we had a chat. Yeah,
amazing. I want to only bash Toronto. You guys have a hell of an airport that way.
Yeah, no, that's funny. But you know what? That's actually a nice segue into what I wanted to talk about next, which actually ties into something you talked about earlier. We talked about congestion. We're talking about Toronto, Montreal. One thing that I owe, again, and going to Europe and coming back, not having it, high-speed rail. You wouldn't have to fly from Toronto to Montreal if you could, hop on a train and be there in, 2-3 hours. If you had these, French style, Spanish style, German style, whatever trains that go over 300 kilometers, Japanese style, that go that quick, you wouldn't have to worry about going to the airport and going through security and doing all this kind of stuff. It would be another option. It would get cars off the road, off these big highways as well. So the federal government here, David, I'm not sure if you're aware, but they've recently, it's been said they're going to be moving forward with high-speed rail. They're going to be announcing some sort of movement on it, I think, over the next few weeks, which was, really exciting. But at the same time, I think Andrew can kind of back me up here. It's kind of like Charlie Brown and the football always kind of being pulled at the last second. Like, we always hear that, this government wants to do high-speed rail, and they'll commission some study, and then they say they want to do it, and then they just, sorry, we don't have the money for it. Or a new government will kind of come in and say, well, this isn't a priority for us, and it just kind of goes back into the into the planning list of ideas. But I know the U.S. You guys are having your first one that actually has been, I think the construction has started between Vegas and L.A. Correct me if I'm wrong. There's a high-speed rail line that is being built. Are we finally, as North America, maybe going to have some high speed rail lines.
Well,
Any hope there?
and I do want to interject, just like provide a little bit of a history, because yeah, over the past couple of decades, every once in a while, somebody will bring up high speed rail, and everybody will get excited from the Windsor to Quebec City corridor. But it's sometimes it's not high speed rail. Sometimes it's higher speed rail or high frequency rail, or
High-ish
they're
speed
playing
rail.
with this like
Yeah.
nebulous definition of what high speed rail actually is.
Yeah. Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, it's basically like a line that you could draw more or less from Windsor to Quebec City. Am I right? And it's
Yeah,
Yeah.
remarkably
and
linear.
it's and I can't remember what the percentage of is, but it's just like this is essentially where all Canadians live.
Like over
Yeah.
50% of the country. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's I mean it is sort of like hard to miss in that way. Um so for all right, so there's a couple of questions there, a couple of points I think you guys are making. So for in terms of the US, yeah, I mean the last few years have really been sort of like a an exciting period for rail in the US with Brightline in between Orlando and Miami. That's the company that's also building the sort of outskirts of LA to Las Vegas line as well. And meanwhile, Amtrak itself is exploring high speed rail between Dallas and Houston, which is another major investment. I think that effort, at least to the federal side, is likely to have some serious issues in the next 4 years. I hate to say it, so let's just be honest about that.
Yeah,
Um,
Uh,
but but I think what I would say is, there's a good book or an interesting book if you're for those who find rail stuff compelling. Came out a few months ago called The Northeast Corridor, and I read it and did a Q&A with the author in for Bloomberg City Lab a few months ago when it came out. And one of the I think the points that really resonated with me from talking with the author was to basically say like high like there's this really deep focus on like high speed rail, fast service. And I think that we sort of the Shinkansen has made that famous in Japan, and we think about what's happening in China. But in a lot of ways, like you look at like what's happening in Germany, where the train can go really fast, but it's a freaking disaster right now. Deutsche Rail, like like Deutsche Bahn, excuse me, it's the trains are late so often they've been banned from Switzerland because
I read about that. Yeah.
they mess
what
up this
what happened to
timetables.
German efficiency?
Yeah, seriously. No, it's a real question. But my point is, sometimes rather than trying to get that marginal 10 or 20 kilometers per hour, what's more important is providing frequent, reliable service. If you do that, like how long, like right now, what is it? How long does it take to get to Montreal from Toronto on rail? It's like 5 hours, maybe. Is that
Yes,
right?
I think it's 5 hours to Ottawa, but 6 hours to Montreal.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I'm sure it could.
And that's if nothing. Again, we have our national operator Via Rail has a tendency for the train to just stop, and we technically they have to give way to the freight trains because they don't actually own the tracks. So sometimes you have to go and just wait for the trains to. So it can end up being longer sometimes too.
Yeah.
That's an issue for Amtrak too. In fact, the Northeast Corridor between Boston and Washington is the only area, I believe, of the whole Amtrak network that is owned by Amtrak. The rails are actually owned, but it's like I think rather than I would say like yes, high speed rail is great. It's good for the planet. It's good for cities. It's good for encouraging mobility and encouraging business through economic development. But sometimes what we need most is not speed, but frequency and reliability. Because I've heard the same stories that you just mentioned about Via being irregular, and that's all the more reason to fly. Which, by the way, is irregular too. Like
Yeah.
you get delays there, but sometimes somehow people, it's weird. It's like a 20-minute delay on the train feels like, oh my god, how could you do this to me? But if you are flying and you're 20 minutes late, it feels like it's less of an issue. Is it just me, or does it feel that way?
Yeah, I think I definitely get your point. Yeah.
It's like some sort of psychological thing.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, bringing in the airlines is kind of interesting, actually. And it's one of those silver linings that we have with this plan. Like maybe it's actually going forward because apparently Air Canada, our big main airline, wants to invest in high-speed rail down that corridor. And when I first heard that, I was a little skeptical. It's just like, oh, they just want to, use their influence to put the kibosh on it. But apparently, Air Canada loses money on a lot of the flights in that corridor. They're just like, they're a lot of hour-long flights, and apparently it's just not that economically feasible for them to continue doing that. So them investing in high-speed rail is another way for them to make money off of it. So I'm cautiously optimistic that maybe now is the time when things actually happen.
Why did they lose money on it?
This is just what I heard. Apparently, it's just like the fuel costs are going up and stuff like that. So I think that's about it.
I find that strange because ordinarily short haul flights between big cities are among the most profitable because you don't have to spend a lot of time on on wages and on fuel. And you can also, because they're short, you can just sort of you can do more
Right.
of
Yeah,
the
you can do more
output
frequency.
the plane in an average day. I mean, for what it's worth, it's also just I'm scratching my head based on my own personal experience where I spent something like it was nothing cheaper than $260 one way between Montreal and Toronto a few weeks ahead of time. Like, if that's not profitable, maybe Air Canada has some deeper problems than whatever else. I don't know.
Fair enough. Yeah. Well, that's another problem with rail versus flights, actually, because we went up to a convention in Ottawa, and it was actually a toss up, just like cost wise. The Via train frequently approach the price of the air tickets within these short haul flights. It's just like that really shouldn't be what's driving you away from the trains. It's like this should be a lot more affordable. So we'll see how that pans out.
Yeah. I mean, that's another point too. Is just the cost of these can be exorbitant, particularly if you've got a family. I worry it just nudges people to drive. If it's going to be a 4-hour drive and the train is going to cost you $80 a person or $100 a person,
well, that's another thing. If you can avoid the initial Toronto traffic, it probably would actually only be about 4 hours to drive from Toronto to Ottawa. It's really that first 2 hours where you can't leave Toronto that actually make it a little less practical.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it.
So, David, we talked we talked a lot about kind of big city issues. We talked about intercity. A lot of the people that listen to our podcast are actually from smaller communities across the province, and kind of wanted to shift our attention a little bit to that. In the past, you talked about, or you've written about, microtransit initiatives. I think you have something transit on demand. Even you might have an article coming out a bit on that in shortly. But I know a couple of years ago you wrote something about the Innisfil Uber partnership that they had done to the instituted to try to kind of have some sort of availability of transit in some of these rural areas. Talk to us a bit about this in general. I know there's that as a model. Is there anything else that you've kind of seen, or that are, for example, our rural mayors or rural councillors that are listening in, that something they should be considering in this kind of space?
Yeah. So first of all, I should give credit where credit is due. It was another journalist who I'm friendly with, Laura Bliss, who wrote a whole story about the Innisfil experiment with on-demand transit. That was, at this point, gosh, like 5 years ago or so. But folks could find it pretty easily if you just Google Innisfil Bloomberg City Lab. It should come right up. The author's name again is Laura Bliss. But it's interesting. I just came back. I was speaking at the biggest North American transit conference of the year, Transform, in Anaheim, California. And, just walking around talking to folks, one of the hottest topics was on-demand transit, microtransit, often in smaller towns, with the idea being like you could potentially save money and have a better experience by replacing fixed route bus service with these sort of smaller shuttles that arrive when people request them and have customized journeys with algorithms setting them based on where people have origins and destinations. And it sounds great. It sounds like you can have your cake and eat it too. You can, pay the $1.50 or $2, whatever it is, of a transit fare while getting, on-demand door-to-door service. And this is one of those things like, if it like what your parents may have told you, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Well, it is here because it's incredibly expensive through subsidies to provide those kinds of trips. And every additional trip incurs the same additional marginal cost. There's no economies of scale like you'd have with a bus, where like the additional passenger costs very little. Once you've already got the bus moving, you're paying for fuel, you're paying for the operator's time. It's not the same when you're operating a small van instead. So my fear with microtransit, and we've already seen this happen in a bunch of places, including in Innisfil, is that it's so great to basically have customized Uber trips in a shuttle van, and pay $2 for them, that invariably you have too many people requesting them, and the subsidies go through the roof. You hit your budget constraint, and now you're facing a really difficult decision as a city leader. Are you going to throw more money into the subsidies, which could end up further depleting other public services? Are you going to put a constraint on service, meaning like you can only take X number of trips per month, which I think Innisfil did, if I'm not mistaken, which to me flies in the face of the whole purpose of public transit. The idea of limiting the availability of transit for an individual is just anathema to the very premise of it. Or are you going to implicitly ration service by just making people wait longer, or charge them more for it? These are all suboptimal outcomes, and I guess I would caution those who might be contemplating on-demand service replacing fixed route service in really anywhere, but certainly in small towns as well, that just play it out. Like, what will you do if it becomes more popular than you're forecasting? Because it probably will. And then you're going to have some really difficult decisions. So, what is the alternative to that? I think that's probably a longer conversation. But I always say that, the small towns were the original urban, they were the original downtowns. Like, and I think in some ways, like getting back to the dense urban core of small town Canada and small town America, where people can take care of a lot of their trips on foot or by biking because it's only a few blocks, is something that I think we do really well to get back to. The problem is we have a lot of land use now that involves far flung sort of like homes further from those downtowns that necessitates a car. And that's something we'll have to reckon with.
Yeah, and that's one of the longer effects of what you were talking about earlier with induced demand, where it's just like over time people move out further because they think that they got the transit options to actually get out, and it just compounds it, and makes it harder to retroactively fix. So it's one of those big problems we're having.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. It's like, if I'm not mistaken, it goes back to the stuff we were talking earlier about the bike lane battle between the province and the city of Toronto. If I'm not mistaken, the premier or the transportation minister was saying that 1.2 trips in Greater Toronto are done by bike, which is just such an asinine way of presenting data, because it totally neglects the whole point, which is that in a local community, like around Bloor Street or around like Yonge Street is another one, right?
Yeah,
Like the share in downtown Toronto is going to be an order of magnitude more than that, 7%,
yeah.
8%.
Well,
Like,
also, not to interrupt, but I don't know if it made it down there, but that stat, that 1.2% was actually from 1991. That was a
even better. No, it's so wrong, and I don't know if he's just ignorant or if he's being deliberately deceptive. But the fact of the matter is, and this is the thing, bikes are not cars. And I have to hold myself back from cursing. I feel this one strongly, and I know that doesn't go over well north of the border. We do in America more often, but no, but like cars, you drive long distances, no issue. Bikes are, for most trips, are relatively short, and
yeah,
those bike lanes are incredibly important for local community trips.
yeah,
Taking away Bloor Street or Bloor bike lanes or Young bike lanes would just be such a step backwards
yeah.
for Toronto, and a terrible move.
And that's a really important point, because that's another stat that people use to point to, and not just in Toronto and everywhere. Usually, it's the way that the question is being framed is that how many people, like do you commute to work via bike? And that presents a very skewed statistic,
Correct.
because that's actually much lower than do you use your bike to go to the store or go to this or
Great
do
point.
these little trips. So it paints a very different picture. If you're just asking them if they go to work, is like, no, most of them don't. Most of them don't have showers to work, uh, to rinse off after a summer bike ride or something like that. It's just not as practical to bike in a suit in a lot of these urban environments. So it's just like, yeah, it's a skewed picture for sure.
Totally. Or maybe someone takes the train into downtown Toronto and then takes bike share to meet someone for lunch, and then takes bike share back. Like, how's that factoring into the data?
Yeah,
You know?
exactly.
It's such a stupid proposal. Sorry. Anyway, back to you.
No, we can.
In case you're wondering what I really think.
Yeah, we can keep asking for that soundbite. Yes, tell what you really think.
Okay. Well, I think that covers everything we wanted to talk about with you today, David. Thanks for taking the time to jump on the Good Roads podcast. We really appreciated the conversation. Always insightful. We love your work, and we look forward to hearing you speak at our conference in the spring, end of March, early April. For those of you listening, don't forget to register. This is just a bit of what the conversation will be like, but David will be giving one of the big keynote presentations, and we'll be happy to have you there and to hear him and to see David live in Toronto. So with that, we're going to wrap it up, and thanks everybody for listening.